On May 4, 1945, shattered steel beams groaned under the weight of thousands as German soldiers navigated the twisted remains of what had once been a modern crossing. The Tangem Ende Bridge over the Elbe River, destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht forces on April 12, now served as a precarious lifeline, a single, file pathway of broken concrete and bent metal spanning the river that had become the last hope for survival. Captain William Patterson of the 405th Infantry Regiment lowered his field glasses and studied the endless column of humanity streaming across the wrecked bridge. American forces had reached the Elbe 2 weeks earlier, establishing their positions according to agreements made at Yalta. What none of the Allied planners had anticipated was that this damaged river crossing would become the focal point of the largest voluntary military surrender in Western history. The urgency driving German forces revealed a calculation more fundamental than military strategy: the statistical certainty of death in Soviet captivity versus survival in American hands. Intelligence reports flooding Shechiev headquarters painted an extraordinary picture. German forces weren't simply retreating. They were abandoning defensive positions, destroying their own equipment when it slowed their movement, and fighting through SS blocking detachments that tried to stop them. The Wehrmacht, once Europe's most disciplined military machine, was dissolving into a human flood flowing toward one objective: American lines on the western bank of the Elbe River. The calculation of survival had become brutally clear by late April 1945. German military intelligence had intercepted Soviet communications revealing projected casualty rates for Wehrmacht prisoners. Of every 100 German soldiers captured by the Red Army, statistical projections suggested fewer than 40 would survive to return home. The actual numbers would prove even more catastrophic. The strategic situation was beyond recovery. 8 million German civilians were fleeing westward from East Prussia, Silesia and Pomerania behind them. Marshal Georgy Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Marshal Ivan Konev's First Ukrainian Front were crushing the last organized German resistance with overwhelming superiority. 20 Soviet divisions for every German division, still combat effective. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel's final strategic assessment, captured after Germany's surrender, contained a single underlined directive: maximum German forces must reach Western Allied lines before Soviet encirclement completes. This wasn't defeatism, but recognition of a fundamental reality. Surrender to Americans meant probable survival, while capture by Soviets meant probable death. The first major indicator came on April 20, 1945, when General Walther Wenck received Hitler's order to attack toward Berlin with his 12th Army. Instead, Wenck made a fateful decision that would save hundreds of thousands of lives. Rather than waste his forces in a futile assault on the Soviet encirclement of Berlin, he would use his army to hold open an escape corridor to the American lines. At his headquarters near Belzig, Wenck gathered his commanders. "Comrades," he announced, "the war is lost. Our duty now is not to a dead ideology, but to the living. Our soldiers and the civilians depending on us. We attack, but westward, to open a path to the Americans. This wasn't cowardice, but calculated humanity." Wenck's intelligence officer, Colonel Guenther Reichhelm, had compiled devastating statistics from Soviet-occupied territories. In East Prussia alone, an estimated 300 Zaros and civilians had died during the Soviet advance from combat, exposure, revenge killings, and mass rape. Applied to the populations now trapped between the Elbe and advancing Soviet forces, these ratios meant potential casualties in the millions. By April 24, forward American observation posts reported extraordinary scenes. German vehicles approached the Elbe without tactical spacing, headlights blazing in violation of basic combat principles. Wehrmacht units arrived in parade formation, their officers maintaining military bearing even in defeat. These weren't beaten rabbles, but organized forces choosing captivity over continued resistance. Captain Robert Thornton, commanding a reconnaissance company of the 2nd Armored Division. Radioed division headquarters. German forces approaching our positions are not attacking. They're displaying white flags and requesting terms. Within hours, the trickle became a flood. The U.S. Ninth Army processed 3,000 voluntary surrenders on April 24th, 7,000 on April 25th, and 15,000 on April 26th. The Ra Pocket surrender earlier in April had established the precedent. When Field Marshal Walter Model dissolved Army Group B rather than formally surrender, 325,000 German troops had given themselves up to American forces. The treatment they received, food, medical care, protection from revenge-seeking displaced persons, spread through Wehrmacht communication channels with extraordinary speed. Radio intercepts by American signals intelligence revealed remarkable conversations between German units. On April 27th, the commander of 3rd Panzer Corps transmitted, Americans honoring Geneva Convention at all collection points. Medical treatment provided, food distribution confirmed. That last point was crucial. German forces had been on starvation rations for weeks. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. But reaching American lines required surviving a deadly gauntlet. SSS blocking detachments had orders to execute any soldier retreating without authorization. Military police units established checkpoints on all western roads, turning back or shooting. Defeatists attempting to flee. The SS remained fanatically loyal even as the Reich collapsed around them, viewing surrender as betrayal rather than survival. The Battle of Halby from April 24th to May 1st represented the bloodiest example of the eastward flight's human cost. General Theodor Buss's Ninth Army, encircled southeast of Berlin, comprised 200,000 soldiers and 40,000 civilians. Hitler ordered them to fight toward Berlin and link up with the capital's defenders. Instead, Buss coordinated with Wenck to break out westward toward American lines. The breakout began at 2,000 hours on April 25th. Leading elements of the 11th SS Panzer Corps used their last fuel reserves to punch through Soviet lines near Halby village. Behind them came an extraordinary procession: combat troops, medical units, administrative personnel, civilian refugees, military dependents, even regimental bands carrying their instruments. The column stretched 30 kilometers through the Spree forest, a serpentine mass of humanity stumbling through swamps and woods. Soviet forces reacted with overwhelming firepower. Katyusha rocket batteries fired into packed columns. Il-2 Sturmovik aircraft strafed anything moving. T-34 tanks crushed defensive positions and the people manning them. The forest became a slaughterhouse. Bodies piled up at stream crossings where Soviet machine guns had perfect fields of fire. Colonel Hans Effelnick, commanding remnants of a panzer regiment, described the horror, no longer war, but massacre. Soviet artillery turned forest paths into death zones. We kept moving because stopping meant certain death. I saw officers shoot their own wounded rather than leave them for Soviet capture. The statistics were catastrophic. Of 200,000 who began the breakout, approximately 40,000 reached Wenck's lines in eventual American captivity. The Halby Forest Cemetery today contains 24,000 graves, most marked unknown German soldier. Another 60,000 were captured by Soviet forces, few of whom would survive captivity. General Wenck's 12th Army performed one of the war's most remarkable humanitarian operations. Defying Hitler's direct orders to attack toward Berlin, Wenck instead established a 40-kilometer corridor from the Elbe River to the scattered remnants of German forces trapped to the east. His 100,000 troops, including the elite Clausewitz and Scharnhorst divisions, held this passage against Soviet pressure while refugees streamed through. The damaged Tangem-Endi Bridge became the focal point of the evacuation. Wehrmacht engineers had blown the modern structure on April 12th to slow the American advance, but ironically its twisted remains now served as the only crossing point for 50 kilometers in either direction. German military engineers and American combat engineers worked from opposite banks to shore up the wreckage, creating a precarious single-file pathway across the river. The scenes at the crossing defied military precedent. From May 4th to May 7th, an estimated 100,000 people crossed the broken structure. Wehrmacht colonels directed traffic alongside American sergeants. German military police maintained order on the eastern approach, while American MPs controlled the western bank. Both sides understood that chaos would mean disaster. Lieutenant Colonel William Davis of the 102nd Infantry Division described the surreal cooperation. German officers saluted us. We saluted back. Their engineers asked our engineers for equipment to strengthen the bridge. We gave it to them. Everyone understood lives depended on keeping that crossing open. The human stream was endless and heartbreaking. A Wehrmacht colonel arrived with a complete regimental staff and insisted on formally surrendering his unit's battle flag. An SS general appeared in full dress uniform, requesting honorable captivity for his men. Female auxiliary personnel, some as young as 17, begged American soldiers not to send them back east. Most poignant were the civilians. Families pushed belongings in baby carriages and wheelbarrows. Children separated from parents in the chaos were passed hand to hand across the bridge. Elderly people who could barely walk were carried by strangers. Hospital patients, some still in their beds, were wheeled across by medical staff who had refused to abandon them. Master Sergeant James Patterson, supervising the western approach, later wrote, "They came in waves, dawn to dusk, then through the night by moonlight. Soldiers still carrying weapons they'd stack in piles like cordwood. Women with babies. Kids who looked like they should be in grammar school but wearing Wehrmacht uniforms. Nobody ran. Nobody resisted. They were just grateful to reach our side." The sheer scale overwhelmed American administrative capacity. Geneva Convention requirements mandated specific documentation for each prisoner, medical screening, and provision of adequate food and shelter. Processing one prisoner properly required 20 minutes. At peak flow, 20,000 were arriving daily. The system simply collapsed under the weight of numbers. Colonel Benjamin Thompson, Chief of Staff for the ex-V2E Airborne Corps, made a crucial decision. Forget the paperwork. Get them fed. Get them deloused. Get medical attention to the wounded. Documentation can wait. Lives can't. This pragmatic approach saved thousands but created administrative chaos lasting years. The medical crisis was acute. Army medical units estimated 30% of surrendering Germans required immediate attention. Malnutrition was universal after months on starvation rations. Typhus spread by lice threatened epidemic proportions. Combat wounds untreated for weeks had become gangrenous. Captain David Miller, medical officer with the 330th Medical Battalion, performed surgery for 72 straight hours. These weren't fresh combat wounds. These were weeks old, infected, untreated. Men had been walking on broken bones, fighting with shrapnel still embedded. Women auxiliaries with untreated injuries from assault. Children with malnutrition so severe they couldn't stand. At SHF headquarters, General Dwight Eisenhower faced an impossible dilemma. The Yalta agreements were explicit: German forces must surrender to all allies simultaneously. Separate surrenders to Western forces while continuing to fight Soviets violated inter-allied agreements. Yet the humanitarian catastrophe was undeniable. The temporary solution was pragmatic. German forces reaching American lines before the formal surrender on May 8th would be processed as prisoners. Those arriving after would be subject to repatriation agreements with Soviets. This created a deadly deadline: cross the Elbe before midnight on May 8th or face Soviet captivity. At 0241 hours on May 7th, General Alfred Jodl signed Germany's unconditional surrender at Reims. The ceasefire would take effect at 2301 hours on May 8th. This gave German forces exactly 45 hours to reach American lines. The greatest race against time in military history had begun. Intelligence estimated 250,000 German military personnel remained east of the Elbe on May 7. Within 45 hours, approximately 180,000 would successfully reach American lines. The others would enter Soviet captivity with terrible consequences. General Wenck's final operation exemplified military honor in defeat. His 12th Army held its corridor until the last possible moment, allowing remnants of the 9th Army and hundreds of thousands of civilians to escape. At 1800 hours on May 7th, Wenck issued his final order. The 12th Army has fulfilled its last duty. We have saved all we could save. Every commander is now free to seek safety for his men. Wenck himself was among the last to cross at 200 hours on May 8th, walking across a damaged railroad bridge near Tangem Ende less than 21 hours before the ceasefire. Behind him, Soviet tanks were already entering positions his men had abandoned hours earlier. By 2:31 hours on May 8, 1945, when the ceasefire took effect, American forces had processed approximately 1.5 million German military prisoners in the war's final 3 weeks. The 100th Infantry Division alone accepted surrender of 313,000 enemies, more than the entire German army that invaded Poland in 1939. The differential was stark. American records show that of 3.8 million German prisoners in Western custody, approximately 137,000 died, a death rate of 3.6%. Most deaths occurred from wounds received before capture or disease in the war's chaotic final weeks. Soviet records reveal catastrophe of Prisenkin in 1945. Fewer than 50% survived to 1950. The mass German surrender to American forces in April, May 1945 represented more than military capitulation. It was a massive humanitarian crisis, an ideological collapse, and ultimately a testament to mercy's power in warfare's darkest hour. The event challenged traditional narratives. German forces didn't simply stop fighting when ordered. They actively sought American captivity as salvation. The last German soldier to cross at Tangem Ende was Volksturm member Heinrich Fischer, age 63. He reached American lines at 247 hours on May 8, 1945, exactly 14 minutes before the ceasefire. When asked why he'd risked everything to cross, he simply said, "I wanted to see my grandchildren again." He did. Millions who failed to reach American lines did not. The damaged crossing at Tangem Ende became more than a bridge over the Elbe. It was a passage between life and death, between mercy and retribution, between Western and Soviet interpretations of victory. Those who crossed it before May 8, 1945, generally survived to rebuild their lives and country. Those who didn't faced years of suffering in Soviet camps, if they survived at all. The legacy echoes still. German-American relations in the post-war period were profoundly influenced by this mercy. West Germany's integration into NATO, its development as a democratic state, its role as America's key European ally during the Cold War, all were influenced by the memory of American humanity in victory. The last crossing of the Elbe was not merely the end of a war. It was the largest gamble on human mercy in military history. A desperate bet by defeated enemies that their conquerors would choose humanity over vengeance. For those who made it across, it was a gamble that paid off with the only currency that ultimately mattered: their lives, and through them, the future of a nation that would rise from the ashes to become a cornerstone of European democracy.